All right, a very good morning to everybody. I welcome you all to AIOC 2021 Virtual Conference Day 2. We'll be starting the free paper in about a minute now. I welcome the judges, Dr. Pramod Kumar Pandey sir, Dr. Sanjay Sehal sir, Dr. Saurabh Sanyal sir. Very good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
The other judges and moderator are missing for now, so we can begin with the first speaker. Sir, over to you.
I'm here, Dr. Bhave.
Good morning, Miss. Good morning, Dr. Bhave. I welcome you.
Yeah.
Ma'am, please, we'll start with the first free paper.
Yes.
Could you please introduce the first speaker?
Yes.
First speaker is Dr. Tanvi Gaonkar.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Before starting, I just want to give a small brief. The presentation time is about for 6 minutes and plus 2 minutes for the discussion.
Okay.
And there would be 3 buzzers in between. One would be at the mid of your time. The second would be at the last minute of the time. And third at the end of the time.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, please start.
Shall I start now?
Yes, ma'am.
Very good morning to the respected judges and my co-presenters. My name is Dr. Tanvi, and the topic of my presentation is retropupillary iris claw lens versus scleral fixated lens using Gotex in children with large subluxation. So the management of subluxated lenses varies from optical correction in low grades of subluxation to the removal of the lens and intraocular implantation in higher grades. So following lens removal, the management of resultant aphakia could be either by anterior chamber IOLs, iris claw, which could either be prepupillary or retropupillary, and scleral fixated IOLs, which would either be sutured or sutureless. So at present, there is paucity of literature which documents the safety of Gotex suture in pediatric eyes. Also, there is no consensus on which of these techniques is the best for early visual rehabilitation in children. Hence, we undertook this study to assess and compare the functional outcome of retropupillary iris claw IOLs versus sutured scleral fixated IOL using Gotex in children with large subluxations. Also, we wanted to compare the IOL tilt in the 2 groups. So the study was conducted over a period of 1 year. It included 28 patients with large lens subluxations of more than 7 clock hours. They were randomly divided into 2 groups, both of which underwent pars plana lensectomy and vitrectomy, followed by the implantation of retropupillary IOL in group A and SF IOL implantation using Gotex in group B. So the primary outcome was assessment of the best corrected visual acuity in logMAR, and secondary outcomes were assessment of the IOL tilt, mean change in astigmatism, and the median operating time. All these parameters were calculated at 3 months. So the inclusion criteria included all the patients in the age group of 6 to 18 years with large lens subluxations of more than 7 clock hours. Any patient with gross iris abnormalities, gross anterior or posterior segment trauma or pathology were excluded. So the surgical technique in group A involved marking the horizontal meridian at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, followed by the creation of the pars plana ports and a pars plana lensectomy and vitrectomy. This was the pars plana lensectomy vitrectomy. The retropupillary iris claw IOL that we used was this one, and the arrow shows the iris claw mechanism where the iris tissue was enclaved. A superior clear corneal incision was created, followed by the insertion of the retropupillary IOL into the anterior chamber, after which they were held by the lens holding forceps, and it was slipped posterior to the iris and enclaved using the Sinskey hook in the mid-peripheral portion of the iris, which is the least vascular and the least mobile. And a peripheral iridectomy was created. This is at the end of the surgery. In the SF IOL technique, the horizontal meridian was marked, followed by the creation of the pars plana ports. So both the ports were created 5 mm apart, and the distance from the limbus was at 3 mm. This was the SF IOL that we used with 4 eyelets. So the Gotex suture was cut into 2 halves, and each half was threaded through the adjacent eyelets of the SF IOL. A superior clear corneal incision was created, followed by insertion of the IOL into the anterior chamber, and then the sutures were passed into the anterior chamber and externalized through the respective sclerotomies. After ensuring IOL centration, these sutures were tied and the tension was titrated. So we observed at the end of 3 months that the best corrected visual acuity was slightly better in the SF-IOL group as compared to the retropupillary group. However, it was not statistically significant. The IOL tilt was measured by a technique described by Loya et al. Using the ultrasound biomicroscopy technique. So the distance from the iris pigment epithelium to the anterior surface of the IOL was measured superiorly and inferiorly for the vertical meridian and nasally and temporally for the horizontal meridian. So if the difference between the two values was more than 100 microns, it was considered to be a significant tilt. So we noticed that in group B, the number of tilts of more than 100 microns was higher as compared to group A, but it was not statistically significant. There was a significant change in the post-operative astigmatism from the pre-operative value in both the groups. However, post-operatively, they were not statistically significant difference. However, there was a statistically significant difference in the mean operating time between the two groups, with group B having a mean operating time of 90 minutes and group A having one of 40 minutes. So this is a patient of clear lens subluxation who underwent a retropupillary iris claw IOL implantation. As we can see, these are the enclavation sites, and the IOL appears to be centered. This is a patient of a lens subluxation with a cataractous lens who underwent an SF-IOL implantation. As we can see, the lens is stable and centered. So the choice of IOL to be implanted in children is a challenge, as early visual rehabilitation with minimal complications is the ultimate goal. So if we compare the RP versus SF IOLs in terms of complications, retropupillary is associated with complications like spontaneous disenclavation, pupil ovalization, which is not vision threatening, and pigment dispersion in secondary glaucoma because rubbing of the IOL against the posterior pigment epithelium. SF IOLs, on the other hand, are associated with an increased intraoperative manipulation, especially at the vitreous space. Therefore, complications like retinal detachment and suprachoroidal hemorrhage can occur. Also, there's a higher risk of IOL tilt and suture-related complications like suture erosion, breakage, and eventual late IOL dislocations. Comparing the advantages, retropupillary iris claw IOLs are technically simpler with lesser complications, and hence they have an early visual recovery. SF IOLs, on the other hand, are not dependent on the integrity of the iris tissue. Therefore, they can be implanted in conditions like aniridia and traumatic mydriasis. Also, the IOL is placed in a more physiological position. Hence, I'd like to conclude that both the techniques provide good visual rehabilitation in children. However, retropupillary, being a technically simpler procedure, could be recommended in patients with Marfan syndrome, high myopia, and presence of peripheral retinal degeneration. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think two things. Could you clarify two things to me?
Yes,
sir. Can you hear me? One
yes,
thing
sir.
is when taken visual acuity as the primary outcome measure.
Yes, sir.
Now, some of these children could also have amblyopia. So, did we look at that status of about amblyopia?
Yes, sir. We did look at this.
Yes.
Yes, sir. So we did look at the amblyopia, but many of the patients did not get vision. So most of these patients, the age group was 6 to 18 years. So they were cooperating for Snellen's visual acuity in the form of E-charts. So most of them did not gain vision up till 6.6, and the average visual acuity that both the groups almost attained was between 624 to 660. Some of them didn't even get 660. So these patients were given amblyopia therapy post-op.
But you should have looked at the history, how long that problem, the cataract has been there, because that would probably give you some window into, how much amblyopia could have been there. I think that could have probably given you a better perspective. And the other thing about, did you compare the tilt with the astigmatism, which you said that there was?
So we did compare the tilt with the astigmatism, and we found the astigmatism to be higher in the SF-IOL groups, which had more tilts. But it was not a statistically significant difference, sir.
And did it change with follow-up as the healing process took place? How long was your follow-up?
So my follow-up was for 3 months in this particular study, but I have followed them up for over a year.
Okay.
So the tilt and there is no late IOL dislocation, and the tilts have remained the same.
And it did not change with time, the astigmatism which you found in initial post-operative period vis-a-vis what happened later.
So the astigmatism did not change, but the refractive error changed, sir.
Okay.
Some of them had a change in the refractive error at the end of 1 year, as compared to 3 months.
So that change was, why that change was there? Because of the age, you think, or there was some other reason?
So it could be because of the age, and so some of them also given occlusion therapy, sir, for amblyopia.
Okay. And did they improve with occlusion therapy? Those who were given occlusion therapy, did some of them show any improvement in visual acuity or no? Because most of your age group was 18.
Yes, sir. So not all, so not the 18-year age group, sir. There were 2 patients in retropupillary group who were at 6 years. So they showed an improvement in the visual acuity. So in SFIOL, the ones at 6 and 7 showed a slight increase, sir. If they were 636 post-op, they increased to 618, but nothing beyond that.
Sorry to interrupt, ma'am. The time is up. Now we'll be moving on to the next speaker. Dr. Shubhangi, ma'am, would you please introduce the next speaker?
You want me to? Yes, okay.
Mhm.
The next speaker is exploring the newer indications of POBH in pediatric cataract, Dr. Amit Mohan. Dr. Amit Mohan.
Dr. Amit, please share your presentation.
Yes, sir. So here I am going to present on the topic exploring the newer indications of POBH in pediatric cataract surgery. There is no financial disclosure. As we all know that primary posterior capsulorhexis with interior vitrectomy is now routinely performed in young children to prevent posterior capsular opacification. This PPC can also be used to perform posterior optic buttonholing, which theoretically reduces chances of pupillary capture and other complications. POBH in pediatric cataract surgery is basically described for prevention of PCO. The aim of the current study is to find a newer indication of POBH in pediatric cataract surgery other than for prevention of PCO, and to evaluate the intra and post-operative complications of IOL implantation with POBH in the children who underwent phacoemulsification irrigation aspiration with PPC and AV. This is a retrospective, non-comparative clinical interventional study which was done at Sadguru Netra Chikitsalaya Chitrakoot in year 2019. Children operated for cataract with definitive indication for POBH other than PCO formation with age less than 14 years were included in this study. Preoperative evaluation include the demography, preoperative visual acuity, ocular examination, and BS scan ultrasonography. Indication of POBH in that particular case, like traumatic cataract, anterior capsular axis extensor, large anterior CCC, fibrosed or ruptured capsule, complicated or uveitic cataract were noted. This is the surgical technique which shows that this was a case of anterior capsular axis extension, and we have done the POBH in this case. Lancement or aspiration was done by bimanual irrigation aspiration. 3-piece IOL was implanted in the bag. And then central 4 to 5 mm PPC was created by using vitrectorexis, and minimal anterior vitrectomy was done. The optic of IOL was gently pushed behind the PPC and was buttonholed by slight sideways tilting movements. Complete optic capture was confirmed by the ellipsoid pattern of the posterior capsule. Post-operative evaluation in patients were followed up at day 1, 1 month, and 6 months. And each follow-up visit anterior segment examination was done by table-mounted or handheld slit lamp to look for signs of ocular inflammation, IOL position, IOL centration, and posterior capsular opacification. Post-operative complications were defined as heightened post-operative inflammation if anterior chamber cells more than +2, raised IOP if IOP more than 22. Decentration of IOL was defined when the distance of center of IOL from the center of cornea was more than 2 mm, and tilt was noted if any edge of the optic was out of PPC margin or anterior capsular axis margin. Out of 1,470 operated pediatric cataract during a study period, total 139 children underwent for POBH. The mean age of children were 7.4 plus minus 5.1 years, 84 were male and 55 were females. There were 76 congenital cataract and 63 traumatic cataract. Mean follow-up period was 1.2 years. These are the indications of POBH in congenital cataract, which includes the anterior capsular axis extension in 26 cases, large anterior capsular axis in 6 cases, posterior capsular tear in 5 cases, posterior lenticonus in 4, anterior megophthalmos, absorbed cataract, PHPV, complicated uveitic cataract in 8, membranectomy with IOL in 6, and secondary IOL in 8 cases. Indication of POBH in traumatic cataract in our series is ruptured ALC, large PCR, absorbed cataract, membranectomy with IOL, and secondary IOL. The post-operative complication of POBH in these cases include heightened post-operative inflammation in 18 cases, and in 8 cases there is corneal edema. At 6 months follow-up, in 3 cases there is IOL decentration, and in 2 cases there is IOL tilt. Visual acuity was better than 6/16 in 92 children in our series. In discussion, the congenital development cataract, sometimes there is extension of CCC and large size CCC. In such cases, even if the IOL is implanted in the bag, there are increased chances of migration of IOL from the capsular bag through deficient anterior capsular axis margin or larger axis margin, leading to pupillary capture of IOL, optic iritis, postoperative glaucoma, and PCO formation. We done LARB for PPC and use it for the POBH in these cases. Carefi et al. Reported higher incidence of intraoperative complication in anterior capsular tear. We performed IOL implantation with POBH in these eyes to ensure stability of lens, and there were no postoperative complications and no secondary intervention. This is a case of POBH in extended anterior capsular axis. This is a case of POBH in Argentinian flag signs, in which we have implanted IOL inside the bag with the posterior optic buttonholing. We have published our surgical technique of POBH in extended anterior capsular axis in ISO as a surgical technique. We have also performed POBH in 5 cases of posterior capsular rent and 4 cases of posterior lentriconus. IOL implantation in the bag was difficult in such scenario in fear of IOL drop or decentration, and sulcus implantation without POBH leads to anterior segment complications in these children. This technique involves the capturing of the IOL optic through the intact anterior capsular axis margin while the haptics remain in the sulcus. This is useful in the event of large PCR at the time of cataract surgery. There is no adverse event noted in any of the patient in our series. This is a case of POBH in a case of traumatic PCR. This is a case of POBH in posterior lentriconus. This is a 6-month post-op case of POBH in posterior lentriconus. In 3 cases of anterior megophthalmos, IOL was implanted in the bag with POBH in our study. Capture of IOL optic and posterior capsular opening provide good fixation and centration. Various methods of IOL fixation in anterior megophthalmos has been described. We adopted IOL implantation with POBH through posterior capsular axis, which stabilizes the IOL. Other indication of POBH in our study is absorbed cataract, membranectomy, and secondary IOL. As we are not able to open the capsular bag in these cases, so we have captured the IOL through the membranous opening. This is a case of POBH in absorbed cataract. This is a case of POBH in secondary IOL. We have published this technique of surgical membranectomy, and which shows that posterior optic buttonholing of IOL during membranectomy of secondary IOL implantation result in good IOL centration in JPOS. In uveitic cataract, we performed in the bag IOL implantation with POBH, and results were very good with little chronic inflammation. This is a case of 6 months follow-up of a case of POBH in uveitic cataract. We have also performed POBH in 3 cases of PHBB, and none of them developed PCO. In series of 28 cases of PHBB by Jingle et al. Had found visual axis of application in 12 eyes and all required membranectomy. This is a case of POBH in PHBB with ruptured PC.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. Your time is up. You need to conclude. I'm really sorry.
These are the cases of POBH in the traumatic cataract. So to conclude, our study adds on the current literature as a different and newer indication of POBH in pediatric cataract surgery. Thank you.
Thank you. What was your primary outcome measure in your study?
The primary outcome measure is to know the newer indications of posterior optic buttonholing, and the secondary outcome is the post-operative complications.
That doesn't conform with your. I think your cases were very diverse presentations. So if you had some inclusion criteria which you could have probably put into different groups and compared, probably I think to my mind that would have been better. It's very good study and it is very nicely shown. But I think little more this thing would probably give better results. And follow-up is not very long. It's only 6 months.
Yes, sir. We have followed at 6 months.
So I think a longer follow-up probably will tell us better.
You have done the posterior capsule in cases other than anterior capsular rupture?
We have done both in the ALC rupture as well as PCR. Different indications we have done, and we have made the PPC with the vitrector axis.
What was the size of PPC to get a good optic capture posterior?
Mostly 4.5 to 5 mm. We are doing.
Did you have any difficulty in creating that axis? It could get any
with the vitrector. With vitrector, it's easier. Manual PPC, it's sometimes difficult, but with vitrector, it's easier.
Yeah. But size also size can also be.
size, because we have already implanted the IUL, and with the ages of the IUL, we can decide how much PPC should be there for the good
The
capture.
integrity of PCC with the vitrector is slightly less than with the manual posterior CCC.
Here what we are using the Alcon Infinity system with 23 gauge vitrector, and the cut rate is very high. So we are not seeing any difficulty, and there is no extension of PPC. In high myopic patient, in 1 or 2 cases, we are seeing the extension of PPC. Otherwise, we have not seen usually there is extension of PPC.
Okay. So with this, thanks Amit for a lovely paper. And I call upon the next speaker, that is intraoperative. He'll be speaking on intraoperative wavefront aberrometry versus conventional IOL power calculation in pediatric eye. And the presenter is Dr. Chirakshi Dhul. Dr. Dhul.
Good morning, everyone.
Just share your screen.
Yeah, I'm doing that. Share screen.
Yeah, there would be a green icon on your.
Yeah, it's just.
Have you opened your presentation on your laptop?
Yes, I have. Just give me 30 seconds.
MacBook है क्या मैम?
हाँ.
We can go on to next presentation. Maybe she can present after that.
Yeah, we'll be moving on to the next speaker. By the time, if you can just keep your presentation ready.
Next presentation is testability of visual function in children with autism spectrum disorder, Dr. Nivedita Nikhil.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm the presenting author, ma'am, Dr. Kemina Andrew.
Okay.
I'll start, ma'am. So good morning, respected judges and all my co-presenters. I'm Dr. Kemina Andrew. I'm going to present my study in testability of visual function in children with autism spectrum disorder. Is the screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. So there is no financial interest. Autism spectrum disorder is a neurodevelopmental condition which is defined by impairment in social interaction, communication, and the child have repeated patterns of behavior. It have range of symptoms and signs, including visual abnormalities. About 27 to 52% of the patients with ASD have abnormalities, ocular abnormalities, and studies have shown favorable outcome in the behavior of the child if they are corrected. Detection of these abnormalities begin with comprehensive eye examination, but often we tend to ignore the visual function assessment in these children, considering their behavioral issues. Fewer studies have proven, like with supports and modifications, we can complete the test. Aim of our study is to determine the testability of visual function in children with autism spectrum disorder using standard tests and to increase the testability using modifications and support. Coming to the methodology, it's a prospective study. We included ASD children in the age group of 3 to 12 years, diagnosed as per DSM-5 criteria. The child psychiatrist assessed the child using ESA score, which is Indian Scale of Assessment of Autism. And after that, the child was referred to us with a referral slip mentioning the demographic details and the level of communication. ASD scores were initially blinded for us during the initial evaluation time. The following tests were performed during the eye examination. We did visual acuity, distance and near vision, Hirschberg test, cover, uncover test, near point of convergence, ocular motility testing, anterior segment evaluation, posterior segment evaluation, refraction and tonometry. We use supports in the form of sensory, communication and visual. Support is the assistance given to the child in order to complete the test. In communication support, we explain the procedures well to the child. Even the caretakers explain the procedure. Questions were asked most of the time in yes or no format. Response key sheet was provided. Sometimes the child was asked to write the response, and encouraging words are used. In visual support, visual demonstration of few tests like fundoscopy and the near point of convergence. It was done on the parent by the examiner, and then it was subsequently done on the patient side. Sensory support, the trial frame occluder were given to the children's hand for them to feel that. This assured the child that it was less harmful and it's not a painful procedure. And even indirect ophthalmoscope was done in the incremental manner, as shown in the picture. Initially, the light was shown on the child's hand and gradually upon on the child's eye. So it includes better cooperation. Lesser illumination of the light was used. In addition to the support, all the tests were done in quiet environment without distraction. Sufficient time was provided for the child to get used to the environment and reward for completion of test. Modifications of the changes that was made in the test so that the child could complete the test. Yes.
Please go on, please go on.
Familiar objects were used as a testing tool, and green filters were used in case of indirect ophthalmoscopy. The data was analyzed using PSPP software. These were our results. The mean age of the population was around 5.5 years. Males were more common, and 72% of the children were non-verbal. According to ESA classification, we had around 62% of children with mild ASD and 37 had moderate ASD. Comparing the testability with the ocular parameters, Hirschberg test, cover test, binocular acuity, fixation, refraction, and fundoscopy scored more than 50% testable and rest were less than 50%. Comparing the ASD score with the testability with independent sample test, there was no association between the testability and the ASD score. Comparing the testability with the level of communication using Pearson chi-square test, near vision, distant vision, fixation, saccades, and pursuits are found to have association. These are the bar charts showing distribution of testability among various methods used for distance vision assessment, and this is for near vision assessment. These are number of children testable after modification. Again, it was statistically significant for near vision and for near point of convergence. These were various distribution of supports among the test used, and again, it shows statistically significant results. These are the ocular abnormalities we found in our study when comparing with other studies. There are refractive errors, strabismus, convergence insufficiency, and abnormal pursuits and saccades. Concluding, the majority of the ASD children were testable with standard tests with modifications and support. Testability is mainly depend upon the level of communication and the method used for assessment. It is not based upon the ASD score. We recommend ophthalmic evaluation for all the children with ASD during the time of diagnosis, and adequate time should be provided. Multiple attempts we can attempt, and reducing the sensory stimulation helps. Limitations in our study, where we didn't have a control group to compare the same test on a typically developing children. We didn't note the number of attempts used, and only contact tonometry was used. We didn't use the non-contact tonometry to assess the IOP assessment. That's why our IOP assessment was testability was very less. These are my references. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you try to see how many of these strabismus which you found? Did you have anything like Mobius syndrome, any systemic
no, sir.
conditions like that? Did you find those?
No, sir.
Like Mobius?
No, sir. Most of them were esotropic and exotropia only. Nothing else.
These were probably infantile deviations.
Yes, sir. Yeah,
and
sir.
any MRI evaluation was done in these cases to see for anyone having periventricular leukomalacia or any other condition like
no, sir. Actually, our exclusion criteria included a child with other anomalies because it can also affect the visual function assessment, and the psychiatrist did the behavioral assessment. So in that, all other signs and symptoms were excluded, sir. Only the typical ASD children were included in our study.
So no imaging was done in these cases?
No, sir. Okay. They underwent behavioral assessment, also that ASD criteria based upon the Indian scale of assessment of autism.
did you feel the visual functions were more affected as compared to comparable general
Yes, ma'am.
children having no autism?
All the children were with autism, ma'am,
Yes.
and
So,
they have the visual functions affected.
yes.
But in majority of the patients, after using that modification and little sensory support, they were more cooperative, and we could easily assess. The testability was more. We did more attempts, like more 5 or 6 attempts were done, and for testing each child, it took around more than 1.5 hours, 2 hours.
So many could not be even cooperative for visual acuity assessment as well, you know, because as compared to the normal children. So
Yes, sir.
it will take much longer effort and far more.
Yes, sir. So that's why the duration was more, and we did the assessment in a quiet environment. It's in a separate building only for the children. So only 3 children were called per day, and they were given a lot of time for the adjustment. So it was the testability or more after including those considerations.
And did you have anything like nystagmus or, as Dr. Shubhangi was asking, any children with optic atrophy or nystagmus, because they could be affecting vision? These children often have those kind of conditions.
No, sir.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. Time is up.
For everyone who did fundus examination is normal and no nystagmus, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hall coordinator,
Yes, ma'am.
could we have Dr. Chirakshi's presentation now, or we'll have it at the end?
Ma'am, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I can start the
Please
sharing.
start with her, ma'am. Post that, we'll go ahead with Dr. Nupur. I have sent you the details on personal chat.
Okay, but her name is not there in the.
It is an updated.
Okay.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We can.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Chirakshi and here to present on the topic of intraoperative wavefront aberrometry versus conventional eye power calculation in pediatric eye. I have no financial disclosures. We know intraoperative wavefront aberrometry estimates optic aberrations of the eye, and this helps to calculate the IL power. Aura is an IWA device. It calculates the IL power based on Talbot-Moyer interferometry, and this has been found effective in aphakic mode in measuring lower order aberrations, including spheres and cylinders. It has been found comparable to optical methods in adult eyes. It has also shown to improve refractive outcome in challenging situations, including post-classic, post-refractive eyes. IL power has been a challenge in pediatric eyes for the last 3 decades. Theoretically, intraoperative wavefront aberrometry can provide most accurate IL power, taking into account a variety of factors, but it requires certain conditions for adequate quality capture, including patient fixation, IOP more than 21, and smooth corneal curvature. So in pediatric eyes, this criteria, patient fixation, cannot be met. Last year, we had published a paper in which we compared intraoperative aberrometry in cataract surgery with topical versus peribulbar anesthesia. So we found that IA can be utilized well under block if a good quality of wavefront can be captured by aligning the eye manually. So in block also the patient cannot see the target light. So the surgeon manually aligns the light in that direction, and then we capture the aura reading. So the same thing we tried doing in the pediatric eyes. My aim was to compare intraoperative wavefront aberrometry and conventional IL power calculation in pediatric eyes. It was a prospective observational study done at RP Center, New Delhi. It started in October 2018 and concluded in February 2020. Children undergoing cataract surgery less than 10 years of age were included, whose parents were willing to give consent. Any history of trauma, significant corneal or retinal comorbidity, or previous intraocular surgery were excluded. This was the methodology. Under the inclusion and exclusion criteria, I recruited 36 eyes of 20 children. IL power was calculated using modified SRK2 based on the biometry done in UA. Afterwards, in aphakic mode, aura was captured. IL was implanted based on the conventional method because it was an observational study with age-appropriate undercorrection. And finally, we did an IL back power calculation based on previous formulas. I'll show a short clip of the video. The aura works a little different in children as compared to the adults. You can see here that because the child is under general anesthesia, it has to be centered manually by the surgeon. The surgeon is using a McPherson's forceps or a limb forceps to center it. This can cause distortion, and many a times we are going to get a poor quality image. So we repeat capture till we get an adequate quality number. Afterwards, once the IL power is captured, you can actually select what refractive error you are looking at based on the age of the child. For example, if you want +3 here, you can decide between 18.5 and 19 diopters. So this is something which in future can ease down the measurements and undercorrections in children. Coming to the results, 36 eyes of 20 patients were included. The median age was 6.1 years. Aura was captured in 77.8% of the total eyes. In less than 5 years, it was 41.6%, and in more than 5 years, it was 95%. So in younger children, the success rate was actually less than 50%. These are the main values for biometry and IL power calculation. Of IL power, M represents the manual IL power, and IL aura is the power we got from intraoperative wavefront aberrometry. The mean was 24.8 and 25.2 respectively. The mean difference was 0.4 and the p-value was 0.13, which was not statistically significant. In 35.7% of the eyes, the IL-M and IL-aura was within 0.5 diopters of agreement. In 85.8%, it was within 2 diopters, and in 100% cases, it was within 2.5 diopters. So this is the graph in which I have put the data for each eye of the 28 total cases. Coming to a brief discussion, pediatric IL power is tricky. We found that IL power difference between manual method and aura to be statistically insignificant. In future, since it was a pilot study, in future, we estimate that it can reduce EUA time significantly and make the calculations easy because no formula needs to be done to calculate the post-op aphakic refraction and pseudophakic refraction. A randomized study to compare the refractive outcomes with aura and manual methods needs to be performed. But I would like to point out a certain number of difficulties. Since the patient is under general anesthesia, fixation cannot be checked. We manually align the eye for centration. In some of the cases, it may give a large number of error because in one case, the refractive difference between the two groups was 2.5 diopters. So that cannot be eliminated. Even a use of forceps is going to distort the cornea and keratometry can get affected by this. Once we do posterior capsular excess and anterior vitrectomy, we all know the IOP goes down. If you put more viscoelastic inside to attain the desirable intraocular pressure, the residual viscoelastic at the end of surgery may cause problems later on. So that remains to be seen. It is tricky because in eyes where we did aura after PCC and anterior vitrectomy, the success rate was quite low. If we do not do PCC and before performing PCC, we try to capture it, then we have to overinflate the bag, otherwise the excess will extend. So yeah, with that, these are my references and I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Okay. What is the cost of this equipment which you are using? Hello, can you hear?
It's around 1 CR.
1 crore. So that's
Yeah.
a great deterrent for common usage of this equipment. It has to be done in a very institutional,
Yes, it was an institutional study, but sir, I agree to what you are saying. The cost is totally a concern. But if in future we can get devices at lower rate, because when other devices also started, they were more expensive. So eventually devices are going to come, which are going to be cheaper and more easily available to everybody. But first we have to establish like it is useful, then only people will make those devices.
But you didn't find much difference between the aberrometry and the conventional methods. It's not significant.
Yeah, so in this, yes. So it was basically a study to establish non-inferiority. We were not trying to look whether it is superior or not, because in children, it is not ethically correct to start with a study in which we can use this device to put IL power actually. So this is only a non-inferiority study. We have found that it is non-inferior. In future, we are planning to do a study where we can do a randomized trial and we can know whether it is better or not.
Yeah.
how difficult it was to make the eye in the center, because in general anesthesia, it is known that the eye position is not in the center, and most of these devices will work when the fixation is proper.
Yes, ma'am, I agree. That is why in under 5 years, we know that in general anesthesia, the titration is very important from the anesthetist side. Even with the best of the anesthetists, we could capture in only 41% of the eyes in under 5 years. In older children, generally, the eye centration is maintained much better. In younger children, the palpebral aperture is small, the head centration is difficult. So all these factors were a deterrent, and finally we could attain it in only 41% of the eyes in young children. So yeah,
We should look at younger children, I think, more carefully. They are the real challenge.
yes,
Younger
sir.
ones.
So that's what I was trying to discuss in difficulties. There's a sweet spot where we have to decide like how much IOP we can inflate with viscoelastic, how much time we can spend on this method. So that is something which we are trying to figure out. And this year we are doing a study on the comparative results of this. So these.
Okay, so we move on, and next speaker is Dr. Nupur Shinkre from Goa, and she'll be presenting a case report on lipemia retinal in a 27-day-old neonate. Dr. Nupur Shinkre. Her name is not there in the
update, sir.
Her name is not there in the list. So please put her name and her AIOC number, that is 22741.
How do we mark her then at the end of it?
Mark, yes, at the end of the sheet, you just create another column and mark her.
This is Dr. Nupur.
Dr. Nupur Shinkre.
That is very difficult to pronounce. I'll write Dr. Nupur.
Hello, sir. Am I visible?
Yes.
Is my screen visible?
Go on.
Yeah. So, hello and a very good morning to the respected judges and my fellow colleagues. I am Dr. Nupur Shinkre, and today I will be presenting a case report on lipemia retinalis in a 27-day-old neonate. We have published this case report in the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology, and it has been awarded the best paper at the Goa Ophthalmological Society Conference 21. So, I do not have any financial disclosures. Lipemia retinalis is a rare manifestation of primary as well as secondary hyperlipidemia, more commonly familial hyperchylomicronemia. However, it may also be seen in familial combined hyperlipidemia, which presents as hypercholesterolemia or more commonly hypertriglyceridemia, and is the commonest form of genetic hyperlipidemia with an incidence of 1 to 2% in the general population. The characteristic fundus finding is retinal blood vessel discoloration, which ranges from salmon pink to creamish white, depending on the level of plasma triglycerides. It starts becoming evident when the triglyceride level exceeds 2,500 milligrams per deciliter. The grading of lipemia retinalis as provided by Winger and Sachs ranges from early, in which only the peripheral retinal vessels assume the whitish discoloration, and it then progresses to moderate and marked, and ultimately the entire retina gets a salmon color and all the vessels show the milky discoloration. So a 27-day-old male newborn born at term to parents with third-degree consanguineous marriage was admitted with chief complaints of profuse light pink-colored umbilical and ear bleeds since a day. There was positive family history of hyperlipidemia in the mother and the immediate maternal sibling. The per-abdominal examination revealed grade 3 hepatomegaly and grade 2 splenomegaly. These were the fundus picture, which revealed pale optic discs with a salmon pink retinal background and tortuous dilated milky white retinal blood vessels bilaterally, suggestive of grade 3 lipemia retinalis. A biochemical workup was done, which revealed a low hemoglobin level, markedly raised levels of serum total cholesterol, serum triglycerides, serum LDL, and serum ApoB, and low serum HDL levels. The other causes of secondary hyperlipidemia were ruled out, and the neonate was clinically diagnosed to have lipemia retinalis secondary to familial combined hyperlipidemia. The neonate was started on lipid-lowering agents, antibiotics, IV fluids, and blood transfusions, and was weaned on skim milk. However, unfortunately, he succumbed to sepsis. We did an extensive review of literature. The Google Scholar and PubMed databases were reviewed to ascertain the number of cases of lipemia retinalis, which have been reported in newborns and infants less than 16 weeks till the year 2018. So as per our literature review, only 20 cases have been reported so far, of which 7 have been reported in male infants. The youngest reported male newborn with lipemia retinalis is a 28-day-old suffering from familial hyperlipidemia secondary to lipoprotein lipase deficiency. And among the female newborns, the youngest has been reported in a 3-day-old secondary to familial chylomicronemia with a gene mutation. To the best of our knowledge, no other case of familial combined hyperlipidemia showing grade 3 lipemia retinalis with such markedly elevated serum total cholesterol and triglyceride levels has been reported in a male neonate as young as 27 days, which makes this case report unique and presentable. Furthermore, the literature review also highlights a few cases of lipemia retinalis, which have been accidentally detected while screening premature newborns for retinopathy of prematurity, which warrants appropriate referral of suspicious cases and their detailed ophthalmological evaluation in order to detect the presence of lipemia retinalis. I would like to conclude by highlighting that persistent and uncontrolled hypercholesterolemia and hypertriglyceridemia, especially in newborns and infants, can lead to other morbidities such as premature atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, pancreatitis, and hepatic failure, which may be fatal. Hence, early detection and demonstration of lipemia retinalis in such cases becomes important. Thank you.
Very interesting presentation. What were the systemic pediatricians? What did they diagnose it as? Was it some liver issues or hepatic issues in this child?
So actually, the child, when the per abdominal examination was done, the child was found to have hepatosplenomegaly. Also, the blood which they collected was kind of milky and frothy. So they sent a ophthalmology review for this patient, a fundus examination. So we diagnosed the patient to have lipemia retinalis, and it was kind of matching with the biochemical workup of the patient. The triglyceride levels had crossed 10,000. So it was consistent with the findings.
But they did not make any diagnosis, the pediatricians or physicians, because that's more important, because there was some gross abnormality, I think, with the hepatic function or something systemic, I think. Which
yes, sir. It was diagnosed as familial combined hyperlipidemia because there was no other secondary cause for the hyperlipidemia.
But there's no family history as such.
There is a positive family history of hyperlipidemia in the mother and the maternal siblings. The sibling of the mother, actually, her sister also had hyperlipidemia.
But they did not die; they are alive. It was not very severe in them, probably.
No, sir, it was not severe, and they did not know it. Once it was diagnosed in the child, then the blood sample of the parents was collected, and then it was retrospectively diagnosed.
Maybe it was some kind of Mendelian genetics, some kind of inheritance pattern. Maybe it can be worked out. I don't know.
Yes, sir, it could be.
Couldn't get a fundus picture of the child. Could you get a fundus picture of the baby?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, we took it on the fundus camera only. We positioned the baby that way, and we managed to take the fundus photo.
Okay, with this, I call upon the next presenter. The paper is on prediction of probability of rubella based on eye outcomes. Porbio nomogram. Presenting author is Dr. Parul Chawla Gupta. Is the next presenter here?
Yes, ma'am.
Just share your screen, Dr. Parul.
Ma'am, my screen is...
Yes. We can't see your screen, Dr. Parul. Yes, now we can.
Good morning, chairpersons and all the panelists. Today I'll be telling the prediction of rubella based on... Just a minute. Prediction of probability of rubella based on eye outcomes, that is a Porbio nomogram. So I have no financial disclosures. Rubella is an important infectious, vaccine-preventable etiology of congenital defects with disabling and life-threatening manifestations like miscarriages, congenital birth defects, and stillbirths. Rubella vaccination administered to pregnant women preconceptually helps in almost 100% prevention of transmission from mother to fetus. Lack of initiation of rubella vaccination in many developing countries makes it one of the leading causes of blindness, deafness, with an estimated incidence of 1 lakh children being born with congenital rubella syndrome in a year. CRS comprises of sensorineural hearing loss, brain damage, heart malformations, and ophthalmic features like cataract, glaucoma, retinopathy, microphthalmos, and microcornea. At the level of primary and secondary healthcare centers, where a large populations are routinely catered to, it is plausible that the rubella cases could be overlooked and the treatment not initiated. Though evaluation of ENT and heart malformations requires a trained physician, assessment of ocular signs is relatively easy, and signs like cataract are seen as a wide small cornea, and all these could be easily seen by an accredited social health worker or an ASHA worker, even using a torchlight. Hence, we plan to develop a prediction nomogram based on the data acquired from these multi-center surveillance sites to assess the probability of an infant being at risk for congenital rubella. The aim of the study was to develop a nomogram to assess the probability of an infant being at risk for rubella. This was a cross-sectional sentinel surveillance study conducted at 5 centers spanning pan-India and involved 1134 infants. The diagnosis of rubella was made using standard guidelines given by WHO. For construction of the prediction model, laboratory confirmed cases were grouped as at risk and the discarded cases into not at risk infants. The suspected CRS consisted of any of the following in an infant, that is structural heart defect, hearing impairment, eye signs, maternal history of rubella, and strong clinical suspicion. Clinically confirmed CRS had at least 2 clinical signs in Group A and 1 in Group B. Clinically compatible case was signs and symptoms of CRS, but a blood sample could not be obtained. Laboratory confirmed CRS was one of the conditions in Group A, along with the detection of IgM antibody or sustained detectable IgG antibody as detected on 2 time points, 1 month apart, in the absence of history of administration of rubella vaccine. Congenital rubella infection was an infant with a positive rubella IgM test, but there was absence of any clinical sign from Group A. Discarded cases were the negative serological test for rubella, irrespective of the clinical signs. So the results were the average median age of the suspected CRS infants was 3 months, and the median age of their mothers was 25.8 years. Out of the total infants, 7.3% died and 88% were alive. In our patients, congenital heart anomalies and eye anomalies were the most commonly detected abnormalities. A forest plot depicting the odds ratio along with 95% confidence interval was developed, and the final model showed that the odds of cataract, retinopathy, glaucoma, microcornea, and age of the infant at presentation are 3.1, 4.9, 2.7, 2.3, and 1.1 respectively for the at-risk infant, that is a laboratory confirmed infant, as compared to the not at-risk infant, that is a discarded case. So this was the Porbio nomogram, in which, according to this prediction model, let us take an example of a 6-month-old infant with cataract and retinopathy suggestive of rubella infection. The cataract would get a score of 35 and retinopathy would get a score of 50. And hence the total score according to the nomogram would be 85, which would predict a probability of having rubella as greater than 0.6. So bootstrapping for internal validation, that is calibration of the model, showed satisfactory results. And nomogram along with a web version was developed. So this was a nomogram. If the patient gets cataract and retinopathy, we add 35 points and 50 points, and then we get 85 points. That is here, these are the total points, and that is more than 0.6. So development of web server would help in the external validation of the model by pediatricians, ophthalmologists, ophthalmic assistants, and ophthalmic technicians. It could even help policymakers in making a decision. And this web server could be used in far-flung rural areas where sophisticated high-end equipment is unavailable. And to the best of our knowledge, no such nomogram has been designed to date. So to conclude, we created a prognostic and predictive nomogram using various ophthalmological clinical characteristics of a child with suspected rubella. If the probability of rubella diagnosis could be quantified, it would immensely help in enforcing more care to those infants with higher risk, which will subsequently help in follow-up visits. And the developed nomogram would have a wide community-based utilization and will help in prioritizing attention to high-risk children, thereby avoiding losses to follow-up. Thank you.
Patients, how many patients you saw rubella? I think it's quite rare these days to get rubella patients. How many did you see?
Sir, out of a total of 1134 infants, we took around 1064 infants. That is the laboratory confirmed cases and the discarded cases. So the laboratory confirmed cases were very few. They were around 20%. So rubella, they were the cases in which the IgM was positive in less than 6 months, or a sustained rise of IgG after 6 months, and that increasing titer was seen in 2 samples taken 1 month apart.
So this was a presumptive diagnosis in those which were negative on laboratory investigations. So the other cases were presumptive diagnosis, or they had something characteristic or pathognomonic of rubella to say that this is rubella.
So we took only the for the prediction development of the model, we took only the laboratory confirmed cases. So the laboratory confirmed cases had cataract or retinopathy or microphthalmos or microcornea.
Okay, so they were confirmed cases only.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So how many cases you saw? Rubella is not that common. Probably, how many cases you had? How many cases you have included in?
Yes, sir. Rubella. Yes, sir.
I'm saying how many cases you had? It's not a very common condition now.
Yes, sir. It is not a very common condition, but we had around 20% laboratory confirmed cases.
Okay. Very good, interesting study.
Thank you, sir.
So nice paper. With this, we move on to the next, predicting the myopic progression in children, an artificial intelligence based study. The presenting author is Dr. Ramya Edachari. Dr. Ramya.
Yes, ma'am, I'm getting.
You're not audible.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
I can't control my key. 1 minute. Okay, my paper is on charting the course of unpredictable and artificial intelligence based study of myopic progression. We have no financial disclosures. As we know, myopia is recognized as one of the most significant causes of blindness worldwide. High myopes are at higher risk of developing sight-threatening complications like early onset cataract, open-angle glaucoma, and degenerative retinal changes. The risk factors. The process of emmetropization is in such a way as to match the increasing axial length of the eye with the focal lengths of the cornea and crystalline lens. In myopes, this process gets accelerated and overshoots emmetropization. Younger age at myopia onset is associated with the faster myopia progression independent of other risk factors. Environmental factors also play an important role in the myopia progression. Increasing spend time outdoors is effective in attenuating the onset of myopia, even though there is no evidence about the progression of myopia. Reading at very close distances and more periods of time can also lead to progression of myopia. So why this study? Myopia was mostly studied in terms of axial elongation of the eye, which is the major etiological factor. There is scanty literature on the contributory factors other than axial length. So to reduce the financial burden on the society, as well as to improve the quality of life, it's very essential to prevent myopia development as well as progression. We have a whole lot of parameters from Pentacam HR and Corvis ST. But what are we going to do with this? So to find out the better markers of myopia progression, here is the answer, artificial intelligence. It helps in interpreting these parameters and helps to choose the right parameters for studying myopia and its progression. So we framed our research question, can we actually predict the progression of myopia in children by means of AI using methods other than axial length? Our aim was to predict the progression of myopia using Pentacam HR and Corvis ST indices by means of AI. This is a retrospective study done in 150 eyes of children between 4 to 18 years from 2017 to 19 at Narayan Nethralaya, Bangalore. We have included children with a mean refractive spherical equivalent less than -9 diopter, excluded children with a keratoconus, corneal skull, allergic eye disease, strabismus, contact lens use, glaucoma, history of trauma, and prior surgery. Took a detailed history, vision examination according to the age-appropriate charts, orthoptic evaluation, anterior posterior segment evaluation, and cycloplegic refraction, and calculated the MRSC as sphere plus half of the cylinder. We define myopia progression as more than minus 0.5 diopter per increase per year. At each visit, we have done a Pentacam HR and Corvis ST, and each visit as baseline visit as well as every follow-up. The corneal deformation waveform profile and the intraocular pressure profile we have solved using a new viscoanalytical model and found out the corneal stiffness, extraocular stiffness, and extraocular viscosity. So the prediction was based on tomographical and biomechanical indices only, and then a combination of both, which is around 183 indices. From this, it was reduced to 25 best parameters based on the information gain, which is cross-validated using artificial intelligence algorithm known as random forest algorithm, present in the Orange 3.12 package. Random forest artificial intelligence algorithm is a supervised machine learned algorithm which has an ensemble of decision trees. It prioritizes the parameters according to the in a hierarchical system. So this Pentacam HR and Corvis ST using our artificial intelligence algorithm found out the best parameters in each case. So these were the best parameters in each case, and in the Pentacam HR, the best parameters were wavefront error astigmatism and wavefront error coma, and in the Corvis ST, high convex time, average densitometry at the anterior 120 micron annulus, and corneal stiffness. So this AI model achieved an area under the curve of 0.77, predicting the progression or stability with a good level of accuracy. To summarize my results, the parameters which showed the most significant influence was high convex time. The rate of progression was more in the 4 to 8 years of age group, and the random forest classifier reported confusion matrix showed 75.4% accurate classification of progressing eyes and 73.3% classification of stable eyes. 17 out of the best parameters which influenced the random forest model were Pentacam HR parameters. We know that myopia and its progression was mostly studied in terms of axial elongation of eye. In our study, we used biomechanical and topographical indices, parameters other than axial length, and predicted the progression by means of AI. Our AI model was able to predict the progression with a good level of accuracy. Pentacam HR and Corvis ST parameters were found to have equal power in predicting the myopic progression. In future, studies in predicting just from biomechanics and topography, as well as incorporating axial length and larger sample size, would be required to improve and validate our current results. And artificial intelligence with more comprehensive neural network also should be studied to predict the myopic progression further. So to conclude, biomechanical and topographical indices were able to predict the progression using this AI method. This association could help in studying myopia and its progression better. Earlier detection of myopic progression and thus identifying those at risk of high myopia would especially benefit from myopia control measures like atropine eye drops. Thank you.
But you were saying these parameters are corneal. By and large, they are corneal parameters, what you are saying.
Yes, sir.
Most of the myopia, this is axial. So it's not a curvature myopia. Now we are trying to find a correlation between curvature myopia and axial myopia, something like that.
Yes.
Are we trying to?
Yes. Sir, we have used a modified viscoanalytical model. So from that, the Corvis ST actually calculates the total deformation. So from the total deformation, using a special equation, we have deducted the corneal deformation and found out the extraocular deformation. Because as we know, myopia is due to the degradation of the scleral collagen network. So we have no other instruments to get the extraocular deformation. So we have with a special model calculated the extraocular parameters and found out the progression.
Very, very good study. Very nice. Very interesting. Thank you. Dr.
Thank
you,
sir. The corneal thickness, was it anyway related, or the hysteresis of cornea, we say?
No, sir. Actually, first the first study was about oral this ocular response analyzer, but that corneal hysteresis and corneal resistance factor was not, the results were not consistent. So that's why we have come out with this method, Corvis ST and Pentacam HR.
Okay. Very good. Very good study.
Thank you, ma'am.
You are saying that the axial length and the scleral rigidity and corneal issue, they are related, so probably they affect one affects the other, something like that.
There are no instruments to calculate the extraocular deformation. So we have calculated the total deformation. From that, we have deducted the corneal deformation to find out the extraocular deformation, which is the etiological factor for the progression of myopia.
Okay, good, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have the next paper now on binocular oculotab, a novel approach to treatment of anisometropic amblyopia. And the presenting author is Dr. Aishwarya Joshi.
Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Dr. Aishwarya Joshi from KJ Somaiya Medical College, Mumbai. Good morning to you all. I would like to present the binocular, a novel approach to the treatment of anisometropic amblyopia. We have no financial disclosures. Amblyopia is a cortical developmental disorder secondary to abnormal visual inputs to a structurally normal eye occurring early in life, that is during the stage of plasticity, wherein dissimilar action potentials in amplitude or time or both are generated in the retina which reach the cortex. It leads to reduced visual acuity, poor contrast sensitivity, poor stereopsis, and impaired hand-eye coordination. It is estimated that around 1 to 4% of the Indian children are suffering from this, and the onset varies from birth to 7 years of age. It is 4 times more common in premature babies and 6 times more frequent in children with delayed milestones. It affects the developmental, academic, and social life, and thus it is recommended that it is treated at the earliest. Conventionally, the treatment consists of wearing complete refractive correction with patching of the better eye to promote use of the worse eye. Occlusion is important as as more than 70% of the patients do not regain good visual acuity by just wearing glasses, and the compliance for wearing glasses in children is extremely poor. In a variety of amblyopia treatment devices which are available in the market, only the amblyopic eye is stimulated. Here at the Department of KJ Somaiya Medical College, we joined hands with 2 Japanese universities with the help of Dr. Yang and Dr. Handa. We conducted a study to compare the effect of the amblyopia treatment with glasses with eye patch versus glasses with our open type of binocular occlutab device. We recruited 28 children aged 5 to 12 years old having purely anisometropic amblyopia, that is a refractive error difference of more than 2 diopter sphere in both the eyes. Any squint, structural, or functional abnormality of the eye were ruled out. There were 28 children, out of which 16 were girls and 12 were boys. Their mean age was 9.39 years, and their mean spherical refractive error was minus 4.11 diopters. There were 2 children with severe amblyopia, 22 children with moderate, and 4 with mild amblyopia. It was a prospective randomized trial with 2 study groups of 14 children each. The first group had eye patch training for 3 days, the conventional therapy where a patch was given and 60-minute session was given where the child had to watch cartoon videos or do near work like writing, reading, or coloring. In the second group, the child had to wear complete refractive error correction and was given occlutab training for 3 days a week for 60 minutes per session at the hospital. Both the groups were supervised. To introduce you to the occlutab, it is a regular electronic touchscreen tablet with pre-installed touch games to improve hand-eye coordination, but it emits a polarized light. So to the naked eye, the screen appears white, but it has dedicated glasses which come as a set with it. So such that the better eye has a plain glass in front of it, which makes it see a white screen, and the amblyopic eye has polaroid glasses, which makes it see the colors on the screen. It is easy to operate, and there are thousands of games available to escape the monotony and make the treatment fun. It has the simple Android software and the Google Store from which the favorite games can be made available. For this study, the child had to follow up every alternate day for 8 weeks. That is 28 sessions of 1 hour each were given to the child. At the end of every week, visual acuity was evaluated with logMAR chart, and stereopsis improvement was noted with Pokemon stereo test, which is a form of a Frisbee test. The results. Improvement of visual acuity of more than 1 line was noted in 8 out of 14 children in the eye patch group in the end of the study, that is at the end of 2 months, and in 7 out of 14 in the occlutab group at the end of 2 months. For stereopsis, an improvement of more than 100 seconds of an arc was noted in the in 4 out of 14 children in the eye patch group at the end of 2 months and 4 out of 14 in the occlutab group. The patching and the Oclutab group both showed significant improvement in the visual acuity at the end of 1 and 2 months, but no significant improvement in stereopsis was noted, so results were similar. Similarly, on comparing the two groups, there was no significant difference in the improvement of visual acuity and the stereopsis in both the groups, so they were comparable. Before prescribing this to your patient, there are a few general considerations to be made, such that it has advantages of being fun, exciting, has better compliance, and it is easy to understand for the parents and guardian, and it has an open binocular type, so both eyes are stimulated. But it also has a few disadvantages, such that it is expensive and not easily available because it is still under studies, and it increases the screen time. Also, for this study, have been made better by increasing the number of subjects which were enrolled and the study duration. This is my bibliography. Thank you.
Dr. Aishwarya,
Yes.
I would like to ask you, is this device available in the market and what is the price? Is it commercially available?
So it is not yet available because it is still under study. And these doctors approached us from Japan to conduct a pilot study first, so that later it can be introduced. So we took our scientific committee approval and ethics committee approval, and then we conducted the whole study.
Yeah, and maybe a longer study can be conducted.
Yes, sir, definitely. But at the beginning, we were not sure about the outputs of it, so we did not go for a longer study and for more subjects. It was more like a pilot study to begin with.
Is it like dichoptics? How is it? I mean, is it something like dichoptics what we do in amblyopia therapy, or is it something new?
So it basically presents a white screen to the better eye. So it's not that the better eye is fully covered. It is still receiving light stimulation, but the amblyopic eye receives the colors, and it's more of an interactive thing where the child plays. So it also increases the hand-eye coordination, and that is there are many studies conducted where they said that it improves the neuronal network development.
Would you say that binocularity is still, there's some opportunity for binocularity as compared to when you do conventional occlusion, where the binocularity is sort of evened out? Only thing is your age group is 5 to 12. I think it should have been probably younger age group, because after 7-8 years, the amblyopia treatment is not as good as it is at by 7 or 8 years. So I think that aspect should have been there. And your treatment was for very short time. 8 weeks is a very short time for amblyopia therapy, I think.
Yes, sir, but we were not sure if we will see any improvements because we ourselves didn't know what it is. But then after this study, now that we know that it is comparable, a longer phase study is conducted currently, and there are children being studied. We just lost out on a few subjects because of the COVID issue, but it is still being conducted, and it might be presented next year.
Maybe we can do this therapy first, and if after that, if it doesn't work out, then maybe we can go back to occlusion, something like that. After you spend a lot of money, I think you can go back to occlusion.
Yes.
It's a very interesting study. And you should not compare stereopsis and visual acuity improvement are not always in amblyopia. They may not always run hand to hand, So, I mean, you may have poor vision and stereopsis may be better. It's not always a linear relationship.
Yes, sir, that's true.
So with this, we move on to the next. Next paper is complications and side effects of intraarterial chemotherapy for retinoblastoma. The chief presenting author is Dr. Usha Singh. Dr. Usha Singh, is she there?
Yes, good morning. How to share the slide?
Yes, first you share your screen. Did you open the presentation on your laptop?
Yes, it's open.
Please share screen.
No.
मैम presentation खोलिए मैम.
Presentation is open.
Play कीजिए, yes. मैम नीचे कब बना हुआ ना, slide show कीजिए.
Can you make it full screen?
Can you see my slide?
Anji, yeah, we can see your slides, Dr. Usha.
Okay. Yes. Good morning, chairpersons and friends. I'll be talking about complications and side effects of intraarterial chemotherapy for retinoblastoma. Globe salvage in intraocular retinoblastoma depends heavily on intravenous chemotherapy. IVC works, but it has its disadvantages too. Hence, there was a need for more selective ways of treating RP, and that led to the advent of intraarterial chemotherapy, that is a drug delivered into the ophthalmic artery directly. It was first performed by Rees in 1954, and this is a endovascular technique, and it involves navigation through ipsilateral ICA to selectively catheterize the ostium of ophthalmic artery. It is difficult and it has a learning curve. The major advantage of IAC is that it minimizes the systemic absorption of drug, thereby reducing drug-related toxicities. And as a result, higher doses can be delivered to the tumor bed directly. And the most common effective drug is melphalan, which may be combined with topotecan and or carboplatin. The success rate in a meta-analysis has put all the IAC worldwide as 66%. However, higher rates of 82% at 2 years have been found in the various studies. And in the Shields group, it is 100% at group C and group D. And it has its limitations. It's less effective for advanced groups, and with recurrence rates and always this possibility of elimination of micrometastasis remains. And IAC for retinoblastoma, therefore, though effective, may have serious and local systemic side effects. So we wanted to report the adverse events following IAC in large cohort of patients. All the data of 35 eyes which underwent IAC were analyzed. And this is done under fluoroscopic control by intervention neuroradiologist. We have 35 eyes with a mean age of 25 months, and most of the classification groups were in group D, and it was primarily in 9 patients, rest was secondary, and we achieved a globe salvage rate of 77%. The complications of choroidal ischemia, as seen in this, this is sectoral and large area, sectoral area, and it was extending to the ciliary body and extending to the iris also. Others were lid swelling and vascular occlusions not affecting vision was seen in 3, that is 3%. But one patient had the central retinal artery occlusion, and here is a patient who had this skin erythema starting from the lateral canthus to the temporal region. Others were vitreous hemorrhage and a late ischemic retinopathy. Here is a child with the central retinal artery occlusion, and we can see the avascular retina on fluorescent angiography, and ophthalmic events have been reported, vascular events have been reported in about 5 to 17%. So procedure related to ophthalmic artery stenosis is spasm, which is easily controlled by xylocaine, and others are anesthesia related. The majority of the local side effects were transient, and they all recovered between 5 days to 60 days. And persistent sequelae was in one patient, which was serious and which affected the vision. That was only CRAO, whereas rest all had recovered, and it did not affect the vision, with a mean follow-up of 36 months. None of them had metastasis, none of them had neurological sequelae, none of them died. However, one patient had new tumor as seen in this patient. Here is a patient group 3 years old at age, and she had group EI, and she was given intraarterial because she refused enucleation. And this is the patient, she's completed 7.5 years of follow-up, and she has counting finger of 3 feet and enophthalmos and pseudophakia. Coming to the studies, choroidal ischemia is the most common local complication. Others are blepharoptosis and vitreous hemorrhage. And as you can see over here, there are no neurological sequelae. The vascular events, they affect the circulation of the iris, the retina, and the choroid. However, this study, which has compared the early and recent eras, they found that all these vascular events have decreased from early era, that is 23%, to current era of 3%. So coming to the conclusions, intraarterial chemotherapy delivery demands high level of skill and expertise. It achieved a high globe salvage rate of 77%. Now, in our patients, we need to balance the patient's life with the globe salvage and vision. So we could achieve in 77% globe salvage. Patient remains free of local and systemic recurrence at a mean age of 36 months, and majority of patients develop transient local sequelae which resolve within 5 to 60 days. Only one patient developed permanent vision loss due to occlusion. In view of high success rate, IAC is recommended in the management of intraocular retinoblastoma. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to know, is there any anatomical variation in this ophthalmic artery once you're, you're catheterizing in different children? Does it need some kind of, because there could be variability in anatomical variations?
There have been variations which have been found. So in majority, ophthalmic artery was accessible and others had alternative through the middle meningeal artery. There was a supply from the middle meningeal artery which was connected to the ophthalmic thing, and others could be approached through the branches of the external carotid artery, that is the superficial temporal artery and others.
Yeah, that's true, because the embryology is very complicated for ophthalmic artery. That's why I want.
So they do a check angiogram initially before injecting. So to map, the vascular mapping is done to see the blood supply of the globe.
And this lateral canthus hematoma, which you were showing at the lateral canthus, I think that's usually not part of the ophthalmic artery supply, to my mind.
No, this patient had a supply through the middle meningeal artery, but this is not a hematoma. It's just a skin reddening. And that stayed for about 60 days and it disappeared. Probably local inflammation or occlusion in that particular vascular branch supplying that area.
Maybe some aberrant vessel, if at all it was related, or maybe it was not.
Very.
Pramod sir, this is Dr. Partha here. Pramod sir, Shivangi ma'am,
Yes.
Vikas, we need to finish in time, 9:25.
Calling the next
Request. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Presentation was added.
Oh, okay, never mind.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you so much.
the reason, I think.
Thank you.
So I'll call upon the next speaker. It is on choroidal thickness and beta thalassemia by Dr. Pinky Jewaria. Dr. Pinky Jewaria, could you just share your screen?
I think she's not there, I think.
Dr. Pinky Jewaria, are you there? Yeah, she's started.
She's here.
Yeah.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes. Please go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. So, is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yes.
So, good morning, respected judges. I am Dr. Pinky Jewaria, presenting my paper on choroidal thickness measurements in children with beta thalassemia major.
Go ahead.
I have no financial interest. Introducing beta thalassemia. It is a genetic disorder in globin chain production, leading to decreased synthesis of globin subunits. As a result, there is overall deficit of hemoglobin in the red blood cells. It is one of the most common hemoglobinopathies, and the incidence in India varies from 3 to 17%, and the mean prevalence is 3.3%. The mainstay of treatment is repeated blood transfusions along with chelation of excess iron from the body. Ophthalmic changes in this disease occur as a result of disease per se or as a side effect to iron chelators. Recently, many studies have found increased ocular problems in these patients, but in India, there are not enough studies available regarding the ocular complications occurring in such patients, so we had planned this study. Our aim of the study was to assess the prevalence of ocular abnormalities in thalassemia major children, focusing primarily on choroidal thickness parameters, and to find out its association with mean pre-transfusion hemoglobin level. This was a hospital-based observational cross-sectional study conducted at Department of Ophthalmology at Medical College, Jaipur from September 17 to October 18. In our study, 60 beta thalassemia major patients and 60 age and sex matched controls were taken. In our study, children between the age group of 6 to 18 years diagnosed with beta thalassemia major who have been receiving Paxil and chelation therapy for at least 2 years were included in the patient group, and age and sex matched healthy controls who have normal hemoglobin levels for that age and sex were included in the control group. Individuals with history of glaucoma, keratoconus, amblyopia, and strabismus were excluded from the study. Patients underwent a complete eye examination, and the choroidal thickness was measured with the optical coherence tomography, Zeiss Cirrus 5000 ADI OCTA machine. Choroidal thickness was measured as a hyperreflective zone between the Brooks membrane and the sclerochoroidal interface at 7 points, that is fovea and 500, 1000, and 1500 micron temporally and nasally. Observations. There was no significant difference was found between the age and sex distribution of the study subjects in our study. This is the table showing mean pre-transfusion hemoglobin level in cases and control groups, and this was 8. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, you continue.
This was 8.47 in cases group and 12.29 in control groups, and this difference was statistically significant with a p-value of less than 0.001. This is the graph showing visual acuity of the cases and control groups, and the visual acuity was 0.25 in the right eye and 0.23 in left eye respectively of the cases group, and the visual acuity was 0.02 in both the right and left eye of the control, and this was statistically significant. This is the table showing values of choroidal thickness at various points in the right eye of the cases and control group, and the choroid was found thinner at all 7 points in thalassemic patients than the controls, and the p-value at all points was less than 0.05, which was statistically significant. To summarize, 120 subjects were taken, 60 cases and 60 controls. Out of 60 cases, abnormal ocular parameters were found in 26 cases, that is 43.3%. In the form of abnormal visual acuity in 19 cases, raised IOP in 5 cases, and dry eye in 2 cases. While out of 60 controls, only 4 controls had abnormal ocular parameters, and that was 6.7% only. So why do these changes occur? In our study, the choroid was found thinner in the thalassemic patients. This is probably due to thalassemia is a cause of severe anemia and hypoxia, which can disrupt the structure of the choroid, which is the main layer supplying blood and hence nutrients to the eye. Abnormal visual acuity could be due to shorter axial length, refractive error, and higher incidence of corneal astigmatism. Dry eye could be explained by goblet cell loss as well as squamous metaplasia of the conjunctiva, secondary to deficiency of trace elements and vitamin E deficiency. Color vision, lens opacities, and retinal abnormalities were not significant findings in our study, probably due to we have a shorter follow-up period and a smaller age group in our study, and as we know that these changes are known to occur in older age group. To conclude, beta thalassemia major patients have ocular changes in the form of significantly decreased visual acuity and thinning of the choroid, and this thinness was positively correlated with mean pre-transfusion hemoglobin levels. So a regular follow-up of these patients is needed to detect these problems early, so further complications can be avoided, and an appropriate pre-transfusion hemoglobin should be maintained. Our study had a few limitations, as we lack follow-up, and a proper follow-up of these patients is necessary so as to study the changes in these parameters with the time. Also, there are subjective variations in perception and analysis of the ocular abnormalities, so the assessment of all children should have been done by a single person. Thank you.
So, sir, if there are no questions, can we take up the last paper?
Yeah, please.
I call upon the last speaker, that is personalized medicine and artificial intelligence in epidemioclinical audit of pediatric eye disease by Dr. Sunil Morekar. Could you please share your screen, Dr. Sunil?
Yeah, just a minute. Is it visible?
Yes.
Is it visible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I thank the organizers and the selectors for allowing me this opportunity, and a very good morning to all the judges. I'm just introducing a little complex topic where I am talking about contradictory concepts. There are no conflicts of interest. As far as what we know, the clinical effectiveness of healthcare can be judged by clinical audit with the help of genomic and AI applications. This is something that we know for quite some time now. But what we don't know is that 10 million children are affected by a rare disease with a genetic etiology. And that is a burden of rare diseases. So we have rare diseases, we thought it become 1 in a million, but you have got 1 in a million. So that makes a lot of people who need to be looked at and addressed. What is known as the introduction of genetic testing largely by disease arrays has been highly successful in clarifying disease and genotype in cohorts. And it is now a timely and cost-effective also. I will talk about how we are making it cost-effective investigation that should be elemental to the assessment of inherited diseases. Genetic testing is an opportune fashion. In an opportune fashion, permits genetic counseling, enables families to make reproductive decisions. So what is known so far? That is what is known so far. So what is unknown, whether it actually has an impact at the real grassroots, or are we talking in the air and in very complicated terms? Audits are missing in literature. So what we did is we did an audit over 10 years across 12 centers of pediatric eye disease data for all the genetic conditions, twins, oculoplastic developmental diseases, and covariate factors such as autosomal recessive inheritance, consanguinity, ethnicity, etc. was assessed using the Fisher's exact test with a significance at less than 0.05. 25,495 patients data was analyzed on phenotype. I mean, I'm talking only about how the patient looks and all, with 200, that's very less, 239 genomic data. So I will come to this. The data analyzed by AI and by the data was analyzed by artificial intelligence, and changes are made after 5 years and followed up for another 5 years. So an audit of audits was done. Now, this is cryptophthalmos. In the past, we knew that something like this is a complete cryptophthalmos, not much can be done, whereas an incomplete one like this and would have some this thing. But what about cases in between and intermediate? And what about the confidence with which what you're talking about, and what will happen to the child otherwise? You will try to mean something for the child, but will the child die of something else? This is a patient of incomplete cryptophthalmos which we have operated, and this patient has done great for the last 10 years now. So when we look at the genomic study, these are cases where we look at the genomic study and look at it with the correlation with the phenotype. So the FREM gene can also cause a syndromic form of cryptophthalmos where multiple systems will be involved, and there is a subglottic stenosis. So I burned my fingers where I have taken up a child for subglottic stenosis and ended up losing a child that was 15 years back. But now I am prepared and I know about the child when I know something about the genetic data. So what I offer in terms of realistic expectations, I would offer, and I will offer a good percentage of 47 for the incomplete one. For this one, I will say 7%, and that's a thing that the patients want to know. Now, there are times when I have seen dacrocystitis running in families, and this is something that not many people talk about. Some people come and tell me my mother had, then my Masi had, I have it, my child has it. So is there something that can go in terms of heredity for dacrocystitis? Now, what we looked at is osteopoikilosis with mutations in the LMD3 and the EXT1 genes. And these are the ones which make the bone very thick. And these are the ones you try to do a DCR and you're struggling and like, this is such a thick bone. So having this data is something which is important. But I do not want to know the LMD3 and the EXT1 gene in every patient. I can look at the X-ray phenotype and the patient's phenotype and figure out whether this is the patient who's going to have these kind of situations. So we looked at genetic conditions like Down syndrome, CHARGE syndrome, autosomal, the array, a full array of it, clefting syndromes and all. And we found that results, ancestry and consanguinity were the most two important factors. The other factors don't really look at this thing. So we go to the next step of applying this in AI. So when genotypes and phenotypes were applied to AI algorithms, these are present and available all over the internet. And you can further think about disease progression, and this can also guide intervention. So this is what is available over the internet. There are a huge number of list of available AI and machine learning based methods which are used in rare diseases, that's called as RDs, which are organized by function. So you can look at the mutation detection. It predicts the pathogenicity and the relevance of the genetic variant. So you might have a variant like you have the Fraser syndrome or something like that. And you can sometimes have predict the pathogenicity with impact of the SNVs on the protein stability and what will happen in the other systems. You can look at decision support systems based on phenotype, how the patient is looking. So I'll give examples. Now, this is what we've done, like what Shira et al. Have done. We've taken the raw data, harmonized it, and we put it into electronic data. And then we have done it in a very limited form. A very complex thing you do, you look at zygosity checks, LL check, and other miscellaneous check, and then you tag the variants. This is the flow. The blood is collected, CILI, clinical information, patient directly. This is a huge chunk where we've done clinical information and matches with the genotype. We don't do anything further. If it is not matching, it goes into clinical genomic learning and comes back to the clinician. He takes this patient to this arm. So phenotype and genotype, an example, analysis of genomic data benefits from access to phenomic information. We phenotype participants using the automated and manual programs drawing from the EHR of ours and the research data and research data of other researchers. Now, giving an example, we have a child with clawfoot. It could be an Ellis Van Creveld or a fibrosis or a nest, or it could be Crouzon's or this thing because of the peak. But when
so sorry to interrupt, sir. Your time is up. You have to conclude.
Yes. So we have got the CHD3. So genetic data, we got a sensitivity of 87 and 89%. Only 5% of the RDs have a rare disease have a treatment. Our results, we have a result in 24 patients, 24% of the patients. So any planning in pediatric deprived ethnically diverse twin city may be aided by the use of epidemiology plus genetic and data. Thank you.
Good morning. This is Dr. Partha here. Judges request you to end the session as soon as possible. And the top person of this session will go to Elliott Hall for the semi-finals of the session. So that will be announced, and the candidate who is the winner of this session will have to go to the semi-finals in Elliott Hall. That will come to your WhatsApp or your message. Okay, so request you to wind up the session as soon as possible.
Dr. Partha, should I WhatsApp it to the link you have given or the number you have given? The results. This is Saurabh here. Hello.
Yeah, we have to WhatsApp to the phone number that has been provided.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I thank all the judges, the moderator, and the speaker for the wonderful presentation.